Hello everyone, my name is Tsuki and welcome to my guide to the Astrologian, one of 3 healers currently in Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers. This guide is going to be aimed mostly at beginner to intermediate players, or players who are looking to pick up the job for the first time. The Astrologian is a versatile healer that is able to specialize in either regen or shield healing, and can switch freely between either role anytime outside of battle to better fit the situation and to better cover for their co-healer's weaknesses. While possessing a pretty diverse healing and damage mitigation toolkit, they also have access to their Divining deck, which is filled with cards to help boost the damage of their party members, making the Astrologian an especially welcome addition to any party. Versatile, flexible, and with plenty of damage boost to hand out, being a skilled Astrologian can be a very rewarding feeling, and hopefully by the end of this guide, you'll be prepared and well on your way to becoming one yourself. So, let's get into it, because this is going to be a long one. Alright, so one of the first things that I like to cover is going over all of the spells and abilities that you'll have access to as an Astrologian. This section, and honestly the whole entirety of this guide, can be pretty lengthy, so if you feel like you'd like to skip it or move to any other section of the guide, there'll be timestamps in the description of the video, as well as in the comments section for those of you who are on mobile. Now, those who have watched my healer guides in the past are probably used to me going through each spell and ability in the order that you obtained them. I've decided this time to try something a little new. We're just going to try and group and section each of the spells and abilities into their own categories. As you're watching, be sure to let me know if you prefer the guides being structured this way or how I've had it before in the past, and I'll be sure to take your feedback into consideration when we do more guides in the future. Also, we'll be looking at each spell and ability in their most evolved form in case they get slightly better or get more charges as you level further due to some trait or something else. So basically, we're going to be looking at any spell and ability as if you're looking at it at a max level 80 Astrologian. Just something to keep in mind if you're still in the process of leveling. So let's begin with spells and abilities relating to your actual role, healing. Before we even begin, we need to first discuss the fact that as an Astrologian, you can choose between 2 different stances which will affect the function of certain spells and abilities in your toolkit. In Diurnal Sect, you'll be choosing to focus on adding regen effects to your spells and abilities, whilst in Nocturnal Sect, you'll be choosing to instead focus on adding shield effects to your spells and abilities. This is something to keep in mind, as certain spells and abilities will have 2 differing effects depending on the sect you're in, and the description for these heals can get a little bit wordy, but we'll get to them when we get to them. For now, let's just dive right in. Benefic is your most basic single target healing spell and will restore the target's HP with a potency of 400. You'll be using this spell quite often while you are leveling, but at max level you'll find that its healing power is a bit lacking. However, this spell does have a particular quirk that helps keep it relevant, and that is the fact that it has a shortened base cast time of only 1.5 seconds. Casting this leaves you a small window of breathing room to allow for movement or for using abilities. Helios is your most basic AoE healing spell and will restore the HP of the party members around you with a potency of 330. While this spell is not nearly as strong or as flashy as some of your other tools for handling party-wide damage, there will be times when just a singular cast of this spell will suffice to handle the damage your party takes, and even outside of these situations, Helios can be an ample supplement to another AoE healing spell or ability. Essential Dignity is your first healing ability. It has a base potency of 400, however the potency of this ability will increase further depending on how low the target's HP is upon being used. At 1 HP, this ability can reach a massive 1100 potency heal, and considering how many tank cooldowns will force or allow a tank to survive on just 1 HP, you'll find that this ability will reach its max potency more often than you would think. Essential Dignity has a cooldown of 40 seconds, and at level 78, you'll receive a trait that allows you to hold 2 charges of this ability. Benefic 2 is your much stronger single target spell that will restore the target's HP with a potency of 700. It doesn't have the same shortened cast time of Benefic, but its increased potency allows for it to better keep up with the heightened damage your tank will be taking in Shadowbringers content in particular, and you may end up falling back onto this spell in situations when you are low on other options for increasing your healing. There's also a small chance that when casting a normal Benefic 1 that you'll get a guaranteed Benefic 2 crit, which can be helpful at certain times, but it's best not to count on that. Aspect of Benefic is the first spell to have two different functions depending on the sect you choose. This spell is instant cast, and in Diurnal Sect it will instantly heal the target for 100 potency while adding a 15-second regen, which will heal the target every few seconds with a potency of 200. The total potency of this spell is then 1200, while in Nocturnal Sect, this spell will instantly heal the target for 200 potency and will also add a barrier that will nullify damage equaling to 250% of the heal received. The potency of the barrier is then 500 for a total potency of a 200 heal and a 500 barrier. It is also worth noting that Aspect of Benefic has an MP cost of 900 MP in Nocturnal Sect as opposed to its default 500 MP cost without a sect or in Diurnal Sect. And also, the barrier effect cannot be stacked with barriers that are casted by scholars. There is a lot to really unpack with Aspect of Benefic, and it is one of the most common choices you'll end up casting as an Astrologian, so we'll be going more in depth with it in the healing section of this guide. Aspecting Helios is an AoE healing spell that also has two different functions depending on the sect you're in. In Diurnal Sect, it will heal you and all nearby party members around you with a potency of 200 and will also add a regen effect that will heal for 100 potency every few seconds and will last for 15 seconds for a grand total potency of 700. In Nocturnal Sect, this will heal you and all nearby party members around you with a potency of 200 and will also add a barrier effect equaling to 125% of the heal received. The potency of the barrier is then 250 for a total potency of a 200 heal and a 250 barrier. Once again, we'll be talking more about Aspect of Helios in the healing section of the guide. Synastry is learned after your job quest at level 50 and is an extremely useful and honestly underutilized tool that I see many Astrologians overlook. The target of this ability will receive a buff that lasts for 20 seconds. While that buff is active, any single target spell that you cast on yourself or another party member will also heal the target of this buff for 40% of the original spell. This will include if you are healing the party member with this buff themselves, meaning you can essentially use this ability to increase the potency of your single target healing spells by 40% for a single target. Of course, you can use this ability to also allow yourself the flexibility to heal two targets at once, or to allow you to give focused healing spells to other party members while still providing some healing to your tank. However, it is worth mentioning that regens and shields are not included in the 40% transference effect, so you'll have to be either using one of your two Benefic spells to really get the most out of this effect. As mentioned before, this ability lasts for 20 seconds and has a 2-minute cooldown. Collective Unconscious is a really hard word to say sometimes, but it is also an ability that will allow you to channel a large bubble for your party to stand in. The bubble can be maintained for as long as 18 seconds, however you must remain stationary and cannot cast any spells or abilities, otherwise the bubble will drop. This ability also has a cooldown of 1 minute and will have differing effects depending on the sect you are in while casted. In Diurnal Sect, you and your party members will receive 10% less damage and will also have a regen effect applied to them. This regen has a potency of 100 per tick and will last for 15 seconds. However, the timer of this regen will refresh every few seconds for each party member so long as they remain standing in the bubble. In Nocturnal Sect, you and your party members will instead receive a regen heal while standing inside the bubble, but you will receive a buff that reduces the damage you take by 10% that lasts for 20 seconds, and it is this effect that will refresh every few seconds whilst each party member is standing inside of the bubble. The wording of this ability is quite lengthy and maybe a bit confusing, but the important thing to note is that while you are maintaining the bubble, no matter which sect you're in, you are receiving the same effect. The difference then lies in when you drop the bubble and the lasting effect that you and your party member are allowed to keep. In Diurnal Sect, you'll keep the regen effect, while in Nocturnal Sect, you'll keep the damage mitigation. Since this ability requires your sole attention, it is best used in areas of fights where there are no targets to, well, target. However, you can opt to quickly drop the bubble just long enough for you and your party to gain the lasting effects of the ability before cancelling the effect and continuing with your other spells, but this can be a bit trickier to pull off depending on where the fight currently is and also the positioning of your party. Celestial Opposition is much easier to say and has also been completely reworked alongside with the cards in this expansion, and now instead acts as a healing ability with different effects depending on the sect you're in. And Diurnal Sect, this will heal you and all nearby party members for a potency of 200 and will also add a regen that will heal for 100 potency every few seconds and last for 15 seconds, for a total potency of 700. And Nocturnal Sect, this will heal you and all near party members around you for a potency of 200 and will add a barrier effect that will equal 125% of the heal received, for a total potency of a 200 heal and a 250 barrier. You might recognize those numbers, and that's because these are the exact same numbers and effects of casting Aspect to Helios and their respective sects. The best way to really remember this ability is to really simply think of it as the ability version of Aspect to Helios. It is worth noting, though, that this can actually stack with Aspect to Helios, allowing you to have both regen effects or both barrier effects at the same time for those healing intensive moments. This ability has a cooldown of 1 minute. Earthly Star will allow you to place down a generously large field. You will then receive the effect Earthly Dominance, which will last for 10 seconds, at which time you can press the ability a second time to detonate the field, healing everyone standing inside for a potency of 540, and also damaging any enemies inside for a potency of 100. However, if you allow Earthly Dominance to fade after 10 seconds, you will instead receive the effect Giant Dominance, which allows you to detonate the field for an even larger 720 potency heal and damaging the enemies inside for 150 potency. If you fail to manually detonate Earthly Star, then after 20 seconds of being placed, it will automatically detonate for its max potency heal and damage. Earthly Star once again falls into one of those traps of having a lengthy explanation, but put simply, it is a timed heal and a slight damage bomb, in which you can control the exact time of its detonation. A lot of Astrologians may feel a bit wary of this ability, as it does take a bit of knowledge and timing to pull off for its maximum effect, and I feel that too many Astrologians then underuse this ability. Now, while it is ideal for you to get the maximum effect of this ability with every use, I'd also recommend that if you know you will need some party-wide healing soon, and you have this ability available to be casted, that is actually okay for you to place it down and immediately detonate it for the smaller heal and damage. Again, it's not very ideal to do this, nor is it using the ability to its maximum efficiency. However, it is far more preferable than consistently holding onto this and potentially losing out on uses of it throughout a fight. This ability only has a 1 minute cooldown, and it can be far too easy to choose one of your other spells or abilities over it and neglect its use to the point of wasting the time it could be cooling down. Therefore, I will say, it's okay to sometimes use this ability in its weaker form if it will prove beneficial in the moment. Celestial Intersection is one of the new abilities added in Shadowbringers, and it brings with it an extremely welcome utility. This ability has an extremely short cooldown of only 30 seconds and allows you to have a small amount of benefit from the opposite sect that you are currently in. In Diurnal Sect, this ability will heal a party member with a potency of 200 and grant them a barrier equal to double the heal received, for a total potency of a 200 heal and a 400 barrier, which is actually quite potent. In Nocturnal Sect, this ability instead will heal a party member for 200 potency and add a regen effect that heals for 150 potency every few seconds for 15 seconds, for a total potency of 950, which is again fairly potent. This ability is actually honestly quite fantastic. It allows you to have a little bit of the other sect that you're currently in, which is great. It's especially great for Diurnal Sect, as it does give you that shield, which is extremely helpful whilst healing in Diurnal Sect. But yeah, an extremely welcome ability. Honestly, my favorite ability from Astrologian in Shadowbringers, even beating out Neutral Sect, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Horoscope is once again another new healing ability. When first used, this will cast an effect on all nearby party members called Horoscope, and this will only last for 10 seconds. During this time, you can choose to cast the ability again to heal everyone with the effect for a potency of 200, or you can buff and extend the effect by casting either Helios or Aspected Helios. Doing this will change the buff to Horoscope Helios and extend its duration to 30 seconds. Casting the ability again with Horoscope Helios on each party member will now result in a 400 potency heal. On paper, Horoscope is a nice addition that adds yet another option for AoE healing on Astrologian, but similar to Earthly Star, its execution can be a bit clunky. I've noticed a bit as well that while in the heat of the moment, it is a bit too easy to accidentally cast Horoscope and immediately cast it again to grant its weaker heal on the party due to button spamming, which sometimes that option can be beneficial on its own if you don't want to spend the time casting an AoE healing spell. But a lot of the time, I found myself doing this unintentionally. Still, it's a good addition to the healing kit, and its cooldown being only 1 minute means it'll see a lot of use, hopefully in the way you intend it to be used. And finally, we have Neutral Sect. This massive healing cooldown has 2 features. The first is that it will increase the potency of your healing spells by 20%. The second and much more interesting effect will allow you to receive the effects of both sects while casting Aspected Benefic or Aspected Helios. This buff will last for 20 seconds and has a 2-minute cooldown. Neutral Sect is one of those cooldowns that just seems so strong that it feels like it is just excessive, and I actually find myself not using this nearly as often as I probably should because it feels overkill at times. It's for this reason that I do kind of wish how things were in Stormblood to come back, where everyone just had largesse, and Neutral Sect could have just been a cooldown that just gave you the effects of both sects, and you could have had 2 separate cooldowns and it would have been a lot easier to juggle those 2 rather than just have one massive cooldown that just seems way too strong. But this is what we have, and there's really no use in dwelling in what ifs right now. If it hasn't been made clear enough, this cooldown is insanely strong, to the point where you almost certainly will not need its full 20-second duration in the most situations, really. If there's one thing I could personally tell myself to work on, and definitely something I'd recommend you to keep in mind, it would be to not hold on to this cooldown in reserve too often. It is strong, and it is usable for any situation that calls for a lot of healing. And you have a lot of cooldowns and abilities on Astrologian, but this is almost certainly your strongest one, and it deserves to be used plenty of times. I need to tell myself to use this more often. It's too powerful. It really is, and that makes me shy away from using it, but don't be shy of its power, and use it whenever you need the cooldown. And it only has a 2-minute cooldown, so you can use this really often, so yeah, it's really easy to just hold on to this, but trust me, you should just use it and relish in its power. Alright, we finished with the healing spells and abilities, so let's move on to the spells you'll have to deal damage when you don't need to worry about healing. Now, I will warn you, we're about to get into some complex stuff here. If you're just casually listening to this guide while doing something else, definitely finish what you're doing and give this section your undivided attention, because it deserves it, and you'll need to in order to wrap your head around the intricacies that is dealing damage as an Astrologian. Alright, so I'll give you some time. You can pause the video. Yeah, you guys still here? You ready? Alright, let's dive in. So first off, you got Malefic 4. This will deal damage to a single target with a potency of 250. It also does have the same slightly faster base cast time of 1.5 seconds. I don't know why I said bass there. That Benefic has. And this actually is extremely helpful. It will open up opportunities for movement as well as using abilities without having to cut into your next spell cast. Same that Benefic 1 does. So Malefic 4 actually is pretty cool, honestly. Compass 3 will place a damage over time effect on the target, which will deal 60 potency every few seconds for 30 seconds for a total potency that is 600. Pretty self-explanatory there. Gravity is a targeted spell that will deal 140 potency to the target and all enemies near it. And that's it. I know there were some summoner level complexities and nuances there, but don't worry, we'll go more in depth with DPSing as an Astrologian later in this guide. But let's move on for now. Okay, this next section will be dedicated to the spells and abilities that are more utility based. It just so happens that healer role actions are actually all just about utility based, so they're also going to be dumped into this section of the guide as well. I should also note that cards and abilities relating to cards will not be in this section. They will be in their own section following this one. So let's get into it. Light Speed will have the MP cost and reduce the cast time of all of your spells by 2.5 seconds, essentially making every spell instant cast and able to be casted while moving, with the exception of Ascend. This cooldown will last for 15 seconds and has a 90-second cooldown. This can also be used as a healing cooldown of sorts, allowing you to front load your healing spells to the start of your GCD, and also allowing you to freely use your stronger spells more liberally due to the fact that MP costs are halved, so go crazy, right? It also allows you free reign to move all around if you need to during its duration. The big exception with Lightspeed is, of course, as we already mentioned, Ascend. While this doesn't completely remove the massive cast time of this spell, it will shorten it enough that can make hard casting it a bit more bearable. It will also help with the sizable MP cost of casting it. Speaking of which, Ascend is a spell with a base cast time of 8 seconds and an MP cost of 2400 MP, or just slightly under a quarter of your maximum MP, which is a lot. Casting this spell will allow you to revive any downed player. Doing so will bring them back into the fight with a weakness debuff that will last for 2 minutes, and this weakness debuff will reduce all of their main attributes by 25%. If they should die with this weakness debuff and are revived again, they will instead receive the Brink of Death debuff, which will now have their main attributes for 2 minutes. The penalty for a party member dying is high, and it's unfortunately a price that you as a healer will have to pay in their stead. You will be sacrificing a quarter of your max MP and will almost certainly be using Swift Cast to help alleviate the long cast time of this spell, or you'll be forced to remain still while hard casting it, which will cause you to fall behind on your other healing duties, and you might end up taking damage yourself to stand still and cast this 8-second spell. It is important to revive party members when they are downed. Having downed party members for too long can start to hinder your party's ability to successfully clear a fight's DPS checks or to successfully handle certain mechanics that may require every party member to be alive. However, if the situation is not right, it is totally your call to postpone reviving someone if you just simply don't have the resources or you're just too busy keeping the rest of your party alive as it is, as they do have priority over reviving anyone who is down. Reviving down party members is definitely a high priority, but it is not a priority that precedes keeping everyone else in your party that's already alive. So please just keep that in mind. Please. Repose is a spell that will allow you to sleep a single target for 30 seconds. This has pretty limited uses in most instance content, but there are sure to be a few niche instances where it can be useful, and it can also be helpful in the open world, but to be completely honest with you, I practically never cast this. Isuna will allow you to remove a single detrimental effect from a party member. This is especially something that takes priority in using if you think that a debuff will greatly hinder a party member's survivability or their ability to deal damage. Things to look out for are debuffs that increase the damage enemies deal, things that may slow movement, as well as paralyzation. Poisons are also fairly common, however you can also just opt to heal through these, especially if it is applied to your tank. Another thing to note is that some detrimental effects cannot be dispelled. If an effect is able to be dispelled, it will have a white line above its icon. If there isn't one, don't waste your MP trying to cast Isuna to dispel it, because it just won't work. Swift Cast is an extremely versatile tool which will allow you to cast any spell instantly, as its name would imply. This sits only on a 1-minute cooldown. One of the first and obvious uses of this is to bypass the insanely long cast time of Ascend, and while it is indeed useful for that, it is hopefully not something you'll be forced to save Swift Cast for, because it is useful for just simply opening up some movement if you need to but still need to heal, or if you just need some healing right frickin' now and don't have access to any of your instant cast abilities. There are plenty of great uses for Swift Cast, and hopefully you won't be hamstrung and needing to save it just to cast Ascend. Hopefully your party members are better than that. Right? Hopefully. No, they probably aren't. But, you know, sometimes you might actually get to use this for something other than Ascend. Just cross your fingers, I guess. Lucid Dreaming will gradually restore your MP over 21 seconds with a potency of 50. Now, those are some pretty cryptic numbers, but from what we have mathed out, this will restore 3500 MP over its full 21 second duration. And this is on top of the normal amount of MP you'll be given in battle every few seconds as well. The cooldown of this ability is only 1 minute, down from 2 minutes from before Shadowbringers, making it a much more consistent tool that you'll want to be making use of throughout a fight, even if you might overflow on MP a bit on your first use. This is your sole way of regaining MP as an Astrologian, aside from your native MP regen, so be keeping an eye on your MP and use this accordingly. Sure Cast will prevent most knockback and draw-in effects and will allow for casting without interruption. This sits on a 2-minute cooldown now, up from like 30 seconds before Shadowbringers, so quite the increase in cooldown time. Now, the amount of attacks that will definitely interrupt your cast have lowered as the years have gone on, and the biggest use of this ability is almost certainly the ability to ignore being pushed or pulled by certain fight mechanics. However, since this does have a 2-minute cooldown, you'll be forced to pick and choose when to use this ability. As a healer, your position near your party is pretty important, so it's best to coordinate the use of this ability with your party if you can to maintain a position where your heals can still hit every party member. There may be instances where you use this and no one else does, and all of a sudden everyone else is on the other side of the arena. Those are the types of situations that you want to try and avoid. And finally, we have Rescue. This will allow you to pull a party member to your location and sits on a 2-minute cooldown. Now, the fact that this ability can be used maliciously cannot be ignored, but there are valid and useful ways for this ability to be implemented properly. I will say this, using this in the moment as an impromptu way of actually pulling a party member away from death can be a bit difficult. It just takes quite a bit of mental brain work on your part to first notice that a party member is standing where they shouldn't be or moving toward the edge beyond their control, target them, and have this ability take effect in time to actually rescue them. That being said, it is possible to use it in this way. I've done it before. I've saved people from walking off the edge in Titan AEX before. I've also pulled them away from being crushed by angles before. So it actually does work as a way to rescue a party member, believe it or not. I'm sure that there are also ways to use this in some sort of fight mechanic that involves a lot of movement that is actually coordinated by your party beforehand, but I have actually not used it in that manner before myself. Still, I am glad that this ability has slowly begun to have genuine uses outside of just pranking people off the edges of arenas. Okay, as promised, we'll be discussing your cards and any abilities that may relate to them. If you have played Astrologian in the past and are just picking it up for the first time in Shadowbringers, well, prepare to pretty much unlearn and outright forget about what you know about the old card system. If you've been following the channel for a while, you probably already know that I'm not a huge fan of the changes they made to the card system here in Shadowbringers, but that's a topic for another time. So, first off, let's just take a look at your 6 core cards. These are the Balance, the Arrow, the Spear, the Bull, the Ewer, and the Spire. First off, the Balance, the Arrow, and the Spear now have the effect that will grant you or a party member increased damage by 6% if they are a melee DPS or a tank for 15 seconds. Healers and ranged DPS will only receive a 3% damage increase if given one of these cards. As you can already guess, the 3 remaining cards, the Bull, the Ewer, and the Spire, will grant the opposite effect, granting you or a party member a 6% increase if they are a ranged DPS or a healer, and only a 3% damage increase if they are a tank or melee DPS. So, you may be wondering why you would need 6 cards if there's actually only 2 effects spread out between the 6 of them, and that is because of the ability Divination. Among many of the removed aspects of the previous card system, you'll likely notice that Royal Road is no longer in the game, and Divination serves to help fill that gap. Divination will grant a damage buff to the entire party for 15 seconds and sits on a 2-minute cooldown. What determines the strength of this damage buff is the amount of different seals of Arcana you currently have stored upon using Divination. There are 3 different seals of Arcana. The Balance and the Bull have the Solar Seal, which has a sun icon. The Arrow and the Ewer have the Lunar Seal, which has a crescent moon icon, and the Spear and the Spire have the Celestial Seal, which looks like a circle, I guess. You'll be able to keep track of how many seals you have and which types you already have stored at the bottom of your Arcana gauge. You'll also be able to tell which seal the card you currently have in your play slot will grant you at the bottom of the card in your job gauge. As mentioned before, Divination will grant your entire party a damage increase buff, and the buff will be at its strongest if you have each of the 3 seals before using Divination. And that serves as your main goal as an Astrologian now. You want to utilize the tools you have available and just get a little lucky, honestly, to be able to gather 3 different seals in your Arcana gauge every use of Divination. But let's come back to that in a bit. Let's actually discuss those tools relating to your cards. So I guess the first and most basic thing to actually start off with is actually draw. This is your main source of granting you cards. Using this ability will place a random card into your play slot, and it will immediately begin its 30-second cooldown upon doing so. Play, as we've just mentioned, will hold a card indefinitely until you decide to use it on a party member or use another ability that will grant you a new card. Obviously, you want to always use a card rather than replace it though. On that note, you do have access to Undraw. This will take the card in your play slot and just get rid of it. Never, under any circumstance, use this ability. There is never any reason for you to ever throw away a card. Don't even bother putting this anywhere on your hotbar. Don't do it. Undraw, not necessary. Never use this ability. Okay? Okay. Redraw will allow you to replace your currently drawn card for a different one. This will not guarantee that you will get a card with a different seal, however, and it is possible to cycle between the same 2 cards if you're just that unlucky, and it happens more times than you'd probably like it to, honestly. Redraw can hold up to 3 charges, and you'll be granted a new charge every 30 seconds. Minor Arcana is something that you'll thankfully learn at level 50 alongside Divination. The Minor Arcana slot will allow you to convert your currently drawn card into either the Lord of the Crowns or the Lady of the Crowns. The Balance, the Arrow, and the Spear will convert into the Lord of the Crowns, and the Bowl, the Ewer, and the Spire will convert into the Lady of the Crowns. The Lord acts as a slightly stronger buff for melee DPS by granting any tank or melee DPS an 8% damage increase and giving all other rolls only 4% for 15 seconds. And the Lady is the opposite, granting all ranged DPS and healers an 8% damage increase and all other rolls 4%. The most important thing about the Lord and the Lady is that unlike the core 6 cards, they will not grant any seals upon use. So, you can probably already see the purpose of Minor Arcana. Whenever you are in a situation where you have a card that will give you a duplicate seal that is already in your job gauge, you should convert your card into the Lord or the Lady to avoid messing up the seals in your gauge. Or if you've already managed to fill your job gauge with all 3 different seals and are just waiting for Divination to come off cooldown, just convert your cards with Minor Arcana. Now, as a more recent change in patch 5.1, Minor Arcana will automatically show the Lord or the Lady whenever a card is in your play slot, and pressing the Minor Arcana slot will automatically play the card without you having to spend an off GCD converting the card itself. Just something to keep in mind so you don't accidentally play the Lord and Lady on yourself without targeting a proper party member first. And the final ability to talk about is Sleeve Draw. This will automatically draw a card and give you 2 Sleeve Draw stacks. Upon playing your first card, a new card will immediately replace it as long as you have Sleeve Draw stacks remaining. Essentially, this ability will grant you 3 card draws in a row. This ability sits on a 3-minute cooldown, and you will have 30 seconds to use your Sleeve Draw stacks before they disappear. Sleeve Draw will also not impact Draw's cooldown in any way, so it is best to use this while Draw is cooling down, and hopefully use all 3 cards before your next draw. Sleeve Draw can be a bit of a hectic ability to use, and it's not uncommon for new and even experienced Astrologians to have tunnel vision on their cards once Sleeve Draw is used. I would remind you that you have 30 seconds to use all 3 cards granted by Sleeve Draw, and there's actually no real downside to holding onto a card for too long within that 30-second period, unless of course Draw is off cooldown and you're cutting into using that. You should never feel panicked when using this ability outside of that situation I just talked about if Draw is already off cooldown. You have plenty of time to use all 3 cards, and you shouldn't be panicking and trying to use these overhealing. Sleeve Draw is obviously an extremely important tool. Granting you 3 consecutive card draws can really help you fish for the seals you may need to fill your job gauge. However, due to its 3-minute cooldown and Divination only being on a 2-minute cooldown, Sleeve Draw will not be available for every Divination, so You're just gonna have to hope for some better luck with every other divination cast. It also should probably go without saying, but sleeve draw is also a decent way to give your party an extra boost of DPS outside of the use of divination, as you'll essentially be handing out 3 cards very quickly in quick succession to 3 different party members within a short time span. It's worth noting that a party member cannot have more than 1 card effect at a time. If a party member currently has a card effect and is given another card, either from you or another Astrologian in your party, the new card will always overwrite the current one, so it is best to avoid overlapping cards on the same person. And that is that. We've talked about every ability relating to your cards. The card system is not nearly as interesting or complex as it was introduced in Heavensward, but they are still an extremely large boon to any party, so let's go over some advice on cards before we move on. As soon as you enter into any instance, use draw and have your first card ready. Like I said, you can hold on to a card indefinitely until you play it, so you don't have to worry about it wearing off, and more than likely by the time everyone has loaded in and you've settled into your first pull, draw would have come off cooldown and you'll be able to start the instance off with 2 cards right off the bat. When it comes to the first draw of the instance or the first draw after you've used Divination, I'd highly recommend you play the first card you get without using any of your redraw stacks. You might want to make sure you have those 3 different seals for your next Divination, and it's generally a waste of redraw stacks when no matter what on your first draw you'll get a seal that you don't already have in your gauge. Next, if you're ever having trouble memorizing the effects of every card, you'll find that you actually do have a cheat sheet of sorts available to you to remember what every card does. If you're ever unsure of which seal a card gives, a quick glance at your job gauge will show you that the seal a card gives is shown at the bottom of the card. And if you're ever unsure of whether or not a card is better for melee rolls or ranged rolls, then you only need to look at which card is currently in your minor arcana slot. If the Lord is there, which is red with a sword, then it is melee focused. If the Lady is there, which is pink with wings, then it is ranged focused. Just some simple tips for any new Astrologians or just forgetful ones. Another thing to discuss is a bit of math. I know, don't freak out, it's simple math. As we've already discussed, there are cards that favor melee rolls and cards that favor ranged rolls, and I feel too many Astrologians don't quite grasp how much each card favors a roll. The only time it is beneficial to give someone a card of the opposite roll is if they are doing more than double DPS than someone else in the party that card actually favors. That sounds a bit more confusing than I thought it would be, so let's give an example. Let's say you are in a light party. Your current composition is yourself, a gunbreaker, a black mage, and a machinist. It's actually pretty common for you to find yourself in a situation where you are in a party with no melee DPS. There are simply more ranged DPS and a lot more of them are more popular than the melee jobs. But anyways, to make things simple, let's say your black mage is doing 13,000 DPS, your machinist is doing 12,000, and your gunbreaker is doing 8,000. Obviously, your ranged cards should be going to your black mage since they would benefit the most from them. No question about that, that's just how math works. But when it comes down to your melee cards, rather than giving them to your black mage, it is actually more beneficial to give them to your tank. You might think it's silly to give a DPS boost to your tank, but unless your tank is completely clueless, their DPS should hopefully be more than half of your strongest ranged DPS. And that is where many Astrologians would likely choose wrong and give melee cards to their ranged DPS anyway. If we actually do the math behind it, let's say you drew the arrow. If you gave the arrow to the black mage, who is doing 13,000 DPS, they would get a 390 DPS increase. If we were to give that card to the gunbreaker, they would instead get a 480 DPS increase. Tank DPS is not nearly as far behind in DPS as, well, people might think. If the situation was the opposite, however, and you were in a party where you had 2 melee DPS and you were the only ranged role and were given ranged cards, then yeah, it'd be far more acceptable to give ranged cards to your melee DPS. It's not optimal, obviously, but considering you'll be spending some of your cast on heals and also that your personal DPS is the lowest in the game, it's unlikely that giving yourself ranged DPS cards would outweigh simply giving them to your best melee DPS. And that's not to say you can't give melee cards to ranged DPS or vice versa. In a situation where you've just used sleeve draw, for instance, in a light party scenario, it's more than likely that someone's going to end up with a card of the opposite favor. but in most situations, giving cards to the roles they favor usually outweighs giving every card to your single strongest DPS player. Now, while still keeping everything that I just said in mind, the biggest thing I want you to take away from this entire guide is to give cards to players, not jobs. Now, I need to clarify, you should still be giving melee cards to melee roles and range cards to range roles. But keeping within those guidelines, you should always give your cards to the best performing players, not the jobs that you think are performing the best. You may think that you should give your cards to the jobs that can output the most DPS, like Black Mage or Samurai, or you may see someone who has some pretty high item level gear. But there will be times when someone on a job like Black Mage with a bunch of high item level gear will just not be as skilled as your bard with some lesser gear. It happens sometimes. It can be a bit tricky to tell, honestly. Obviously, the best and most accurate way to know how much DPS anyone is doing is using a parser. However, people on PS4 obviously won't have access to one, and even if you do play on PC, you might not want to opt into using one, which is perfectly understandable. There are a couple of general ways to tell in-game though. The first is to glance at the enmity bar. Beside every party member is a ranking of their enmity on the targeted enemy, and you can roughly guess who is performing the best based on this, since there is no enemy reducing tools available anymore. This obviously only works when gauging performance among your DPS, since tanks and healers obviously have other things that mess with enmity, and it's just a big mess. It also only works when telling how much DPS someone has done to a single enmity. The other way is to just pay attention to their performance and notice anyone who is performing their job poorly to avoid giving your cards to. As the expansions have rolled by, this has become less and less easy to tell from a glance, just from the telltale signs of someone not playing optimally, and things like being able to tell whether or not your Black Mage is actually keeping up their stacks, or if a monk is creeping up their greased lightning, or if a dragoon would keep up heavy thrust back when heavy thrust was in the game, or if your bard would keep up straight shot back when straight shot was a buff. Things like that have generally become much harder to tell because a lot of that stuff has been personalized into each person's job gauge. So yeah, I get it. It's not always easy to tell from glance who's performing the best, and for that reason, I'm usually willing to forgive it and just going in and out of Dirty Finder and Party Finder groups. Usually, Astrologians give cards to, whoever. It's basically just a big free-for-all. But if you want to be the best Astrologian, you want to try and give your cards to the best performing players. Still, I feel the need to say this. It's something I've been saying ever since I made my first guide back in Heavensward for Astrologian. Please give your cards to the best players, not to just the jobs you think are going to be performing the best. Try to take the time to know who's doing the best and try to reward those players by giving them some more DPS, because that's fun. It's fun to be the top DPS, right? It's fun. Alright, so before we move on to the healing section of the guide, there are a handful of things that I just want to touch up on that they didn't really fit into any other section of the guide, so I'm putting them here. And the first thing is Overhealing, which is exactly what it sounds like, healing for more HP than the current missing HP of a party member, generally wasting portion of a spell, and generally wasting some MP. Generally speaking, this is something that you like to avoid, and is honestly actually kinda hard to do this expansion because of how weak your heals have become and how much HP everyone just has now. So it's actually something you probably won't have to worry about much anymore, but it is still something that you can do at times, and is something you want to avoid wasting your time casting stuff and avoid wasting MP obviously. Precasting is the act of preemptively casting a heal when you know damage is coming. This will allow the heal to land nearly immediately after damage has been taken and will help you keep on top of your healing duties. This does take a bit of practice to get the timing down. If you mess up and begin casting too soon, your heal will land just before the damage has been taken and you'll end up overhealing. Still, it is a pretty valuable skill to learn. It is also here that I highly recommend focus targeting the boss. Many attacks have a deliberate cast bar or a telltale animation to let you know when big damage is coming, and it's here where you can take advantage of precasting. And the last thing is stutter stepping. This is a little trick you can take advantage of to gain a bit of mobility while also staying on top of your casts. You'll notice that if you move slightly before your cast finishes, you'll actually be able to finish the cast even though you moved. This opens up a bit of mobility if you should need it. The exact timing depends on the length of the cast, but generally you can move about a little less than half a second before a cast finishes, and be quite safe. Of course, in Astrologian's case, you have access to Benefic and Malefic spells, which have shorter cast times than usual, but for everything else, Stutter stepping is always an option. Alright, it's time to jump into some healing, and let's start off with some single target healing advice. One of the first things I'd actually recommend you do before any pull is actually dip into Nocturnal Sect to place an aspected Benefic shield on your tank before the pull starts, and I recommend doing this in between every single pull in a dungeon or alliance raid. The generally accepted method for getting through dungeons is for your tank to pull 2 or 3 packs of mobs so that your party can AoE them down. Your tank will be taking a large amount of damage while gathering mobs together, and during this time it can be pretty risky to heal, as you will also be moving, but can also possibly pull enmity off of any enemies that your tank might not have hit with their abilities or skills. So the shield allows them to soak up some of that damage, so that when they do have all the mobs gathered and positioned, you won't be nearly as behind on healing. Once you have your Nocturnal Shield up, it is now time to decide whether or not you want to stay in Nocturnal Sect or switch to Diurnal Sect. Let's continue as if you switch to Diurnal Sect first. As a general rule of thumb, it is good practice to always have an aspect Benefic on the tank at all times. The regen will last for 15 seconds and it can be a good healing supplement for just about any situation, and it is also quite MP efficient for the amount of healing it will apply over its full duration. Refresh the regen as appropriate, but if a pull is nearing its end, you might opt to hold off on casting it to have it lingering into the next pull, as it will cause enmity issues if you're doing dungeon pulls in particular. The other thing I'd recommend you use plenty of is Celestial Intersection. This will heal a small amount and also add that shield effect that is actually quite strong. In a general setting, like a large pull where your tank is just taking large amounts of constant damage, I'd advise you to just use this on cooldown, but in an actual boss fight, you'll want to use these to help mitigate tank busters, which are large spikes of single target damage on your tank that is always telegraphed clearly with a cast or an animation. In situations where you don't plan to use it for party-wide healing and mitigation, you can also opt to drop Collective Unconscious on top of your tank to apply the regen effect before dropping the bubble. However, I don't really recommend doing this in Diurnal Sect. The regen effect isn't actually that strong to really be worth the trouble of getting it applied, in my opinion, but if you are insistent on using it, the option is there. Celestial Opposition, on the other hand, while being in a similar situation where you don't intend to use it for party-wide healing in the near future, is actually a great supplement to add for single target healing. As mentioned before, it is essentially an ability with the same effects and potency of an Aspect of Helios, so it will do a bit of initial healing and will also add a regen that will stack with your Aspect of Benefic. It's also just helpful for healing your DPS in case they might have taken a little bit of damage alongside your tank. Now, what if you prefer to heal in Nocturnal Sect? Well, things are quite a bit different in that case. First off, Aspect of Benefic is quite powerful, addictively so. In Nocturnal Sect, the MP cost of Aspect of Benefic is increased from 500 to 900 MP, so it is within your best interest to not spam or rely on this spell too often. Still, it is very powerful and still quite useful. It should always be your go-to spell when you know a tank buster is coming, and in situations where your tank is taking huge amounts of constant damage, the shield this spell provides can absorb damage enough to buy you enough time to get some of your larger healing spells and abilities off safely. So, what else changes in Nocturnal Sect? Well, Celestial Intersection for one will now instead provide you with a single target regen every 30 seconds in Nocturnal Sect, which you should really have no reserve using as soon as this comes off cooldown pretty much every time. It won't be as strong as Diurnal regen, but it can still act as a decent supplement, and you can have it ticking for half of any encounter if you are vigilant on casting it when it's available. Unlike in Diurnal, where I didn't consider it to be worth the time and effort, taking the time to drop Collective Unconscious on your tank is a much more enticing option in Nocturnal Sect. Rather than keeping the regen upon leaving the bubble, in Nocturnal Sect, your tank will be able to keep the 10% damage mitigation for 15 seconds, which can act as a soft defensive cooldown and is a much stronger effect than Diurnal's regen. But on the flip side, looking at Nocturnal's Celestial Opposition, it isn't nearly that useful in single target situations. It will do a small 200 potency heal and add a small shield, but unless you really have nowhere else to use this in the next minute of the encounter, you might as well throw it in there as well. And now we've talked about pretty much all of the spells and abilities that can change between your sects. Let's get into the real meat of things and discuss everything else available to you despite the sect that you're actually in. I'd recommend one of the first things you use is your first stack of Essential Dignity. It is easily your strongest single target heal and has 2 charges and a fairly short cooldown, so it's best to keep at least 1 charge of it cooling down and having 1 at the ready for any emergencies or unexpected bits of damage. If you don't plan to use it for some large AoE healing, throwing down Earthly Star is something you should consider whenever it is off cooldown. The heal from Earthly Star is actually quite huge, as we've discussed before, and can make for a good spike of healing on your tank if you don't plan to use it for party healing. Plus it also deals that little bit of damage to your enemies, so there is that as well. And of course you have your basic single target healing spells, Benefic and Benefic 2. When it comes to small amounts of damage, you can cast Benefic. Again, the amount of healing this spell does can seem a bit insignificant on its own, but it does have a pretty large benefit in the case that it has a shorter cast time than every other healing spell in your toolkit. In cases when you need to keep up your healing and use many abilities in quick succession, or just need a little bit of extra mobility, this aspect of the spell keeps it a decent option. It also does help that outside of a diurnal aspect of Benefic, this is your most MP efficient spell for single target healing. You then have the much more potent Benefic 2, which will heal significantly more than a basic Benefic, but unfortunately has a normal 2-second cast time. Still, when you just need a stronger and more potent single target spell, Benefic 2 is the go-to option. This does cost a pretty high 900 MP to cast, which is equivalent to a nocturnal aspect of Benefic. Following the same logic we applied there, it is a strong and useful spell, but not one you can rely on too much if you want to conserve your MP. Now thankfully, we do have some buffs to help us get a little bit more bang out of our healing spells. First off, we have Light Speed. While not specifically a healing cooldown, this will allow you to have full mobility and access to spamming pretty much as many abilities as you want in between your spells for 15 seconds. It will also have the MP cost of all your spells, which will allow you to more comfortably spam things like Benefic 2 and Nocturnal Aspect of Benefic for a short while. Sinistry is also a very underutilized ability that works absolute wonders for a single target healing buff. This will last for 20 seconds and any single target heal you cast will grant the target of Sinistry 40% of that heal on top of that. And in case you forgot, this works even if you heal the target of Sinistry themselves. With Sinistry, even your pretty modest Benefic will be able to handle larger amounts of damage, and the large cost of Benefic 2 doesn't seem so bad when you only need to cast it once or twice to get a massive amount of healing down. And of course, we cannot forget the extremely powerful Neutral Sect, granting your spells and effects of both sects and increasing your spell-based healing by 20% for 20 seconds. Now I do actually have a little bit of advice for using this ability. Firstly, I would highly recommend you do try and get at least 2 aspect of Benefics in with every use of Neutral Sect. The duration of the diurnal regen will allow you to comfortably cast this at the start and near the end of Neutral Sect without overlapping. The other thing I'd recommend sometimes, if you have the MP to spare, is to actually first cast Horoscope and then cast an aspect of Helios. I didn't discuss Horoscope earlier because it is more specifically an AoE tool, but this can be used for single target healing if you won't need it for party-wide healing soon. On its own, it can be used as a pretty small 200 potency heal, which is actually better than nothing if you weren't planning on using it anyway, but in this situation, since Aspect of Helios will be more potent under Neutral Sect and grant both a shield and a regen to the whole party, I actually like casting it under Neutral Sect if I have the MP to spare, and obviously if I'm going to be casting it, it makes sense to have Horoscope up first. Doing so will give you a 30 seconds to use Horoscope Helios, which is a 400 potency party-wide heal, which even as a single target heal, 400 potency is quite respectable. Again, this isn't the most MP efficient practice, and I would not tell you to do this with every use of Neutral Sect, but damn is it satisfying to have this at your disposal if you should need it. And that pretty much covers it for all the advice I'd give for single target healing. You'll notice that I say advice and not rotation or anything nearly as concrete as that, and that's because healing isn't concrete. Sure, you can anticipate when and how much damage will occur if you map out an entire fight, but you are also extremely flexible as a healer and it's on you to decide what to use and when you use it. You'll also notice that a lot of this section I recommend you use a lot of abilities that are generally more useful in AoE situations, and the reason for that is pretty much always the same. Those abilities are just going to waste if you don't need them for party-wide healing anyway, so might as well use them for single target healing. But that being said, maybe we should talk about what you should do when party-wide healing is something you will need to focus on. Okay, jumping right into AoE Healing. When you are in Nocturnal Sect, it is usually within your best interest to preemptively cast Aspect of Helios or Celestial Opposition before damage occurs. The reason for this is that the main feature of these heals are the shields that will absorb damage. Obviously, these shields would be wasted if you casted them and they wear off after 30 seconds without actually absorbing anything. The heal is a nice bonus if your party is already missing a bit of HP to begin with, but it is not the main focus of these heals. You have other tools for healing damage if you don't need any shielding. The more damage these shields absorb, the less amount of healing you and your co-healer will have to do afterwards. It's also worth mentioning that Aspect of Helios and Celestial Opposition can stack together if you just need a ton of shielding. You also have Collective Unconscious. This is something you should always use whenever a boss becomes untargetable and is winding up their large ultimate attack. You will need to make sure that you have any healing or shielding you want to be done first before you cast this, since you'll be unable to move or cast without dropping the ability. And it's because of this that using it when you do actually have an enemy to target instead can be a more tricky decision. If your party is already close together and is about to take large amounts of damage, I will say that in Nocturnal Sect specifically, it's pretty worthwhile to drop the Wheel of Fortune buff on your party for that damage mitigation. But in Diurnal Sect, I wouldn't really bother with just the regen. Speaking of Diurnal Sect, let's switch sides. Aspect of Helios and Celestial Opposition are fantastic choices in Diurnal Sect for dealing with large or constant amounts of damage. The regen of Celestial Opposition does indeed stack with Aspect of Helios if you just need that much healing. And I will say, when it comes to using either or both of these abilities, let your regens work. You'll see that your party doesn't get topped off right away when using any of these heals, and that's because most of the healing comes from the regen, so give your regens time to work. Obviously, if you're taking constant damage or you take a massive hit and need more healing on top of this, then yeah, add some more healing if it's necessary. But there's really no point in casting Aspect of Helios only to top everyone up with your next spellcast, is there? In those situations, maybe choose a different heal that doesn't have a regen. Still, you can't control what your co-healer does, especially in the Duty Finder. A lot of the times I'll cast an Aspect of Helios and just leave it at that, only for the other healer to cast another big heal, and all of a sudden, my regen's overhealing. But what can you do, right? Now the rest of this section will apply regardless of whatever sect you happen to be in. When it comes to AoE spells, the MP cost can be pretty high on both Helios and Aspect of Helios. So it's worth noting that Lightspeed is great for reducing the strain on your MP, especially if you're planning to cast more than one or two of these spells within a short period. I mean, Lightspeed is just amazing in any situation, honestly. Neutral Sect can give your Aspect of Helios a nice kick in potency while giving you both the regen and the shield, which are both stronger due to the spell potency buff. Neutral Sect can also give even a normal Helios a nice boost in potency as well, but I wouldn't use Neutral Sect just to get off one Helios cast when something like Horoscope can work wonders in giving a single Helios cast that extra reach it might need. The extra 400 potency from Horoscope Helios really is quite strong, and it's honestly one of the first things I choose for any AoE situation if Horoscope is available. But if you want the biggest instant party-wide heal possible, you have to use Earthly Star. I've talked about Earthly Star quite a bit throughout this guide, but it still sometimes surprises me just how potent this ability actually is. A fully incubated Earthly Star can heal everyone in its radius for 720 potency. That's more healing than you'd get from the full duration of a diurnal Aspect of Helios. And even if you didn't preemptively place Earthly Star down long enough to get its full potency, if you see the boss is casting a large pyro-wide attack, you can still place this down and detonate it in its initial form for a pretty respectable 540 potency heal. It's obviously a bit of a pain hoping everyone in your party will have enough sense to make sure they're actually standing in its radius, but there isn't quite anything as satisfying as having a full potency Earthly Star go off and heal your whole party to full after a big attack. Earthly Star does have quite a bit of setup, but it is certainly worth it. If there's any ability I'd recommend you try and use more often and something I'd personally push myself to utilize properly more often, it is definitely Earthly Star. Alright, this guide has been going on for a while, but we only have a few sections left, and for better or worse, this section is going to be pretty short. When it comes to healing in Final Fantasy XIV, you'll find that you'll be afforded plenty of opportunities when you just don't need to heal. Everyone will be comfortable and healthy, and you'll have so many abilities in your back pocket that you won't need to dedicate a spellcast to healing for quite some time. It is in these instances when you should be DPSing. You might have heard someone talk about the ABCs of casters, or always be casting. It's a pretty silly thing to say, but it gets the point across. Anytime you're spending idle and not casting is wasted time, and it is in these instances where you should be DPSing. With the release of Shadowbringers, the DPS capabilities of healers have been cut back and simplified, and with Astrologian, it really doesn't get any more basic than this really. For single target damage, it really is as simple as upkeeping your Combust 3 dot and then proceeding into Malefic 4 spam until you need to refresh Combust 3 again. As we've discussed before, your Malefic spells share a common trait with your Benefic spell in that it is slightly faster than usual to cast this, leaving you a bit of time to use abilities freely without cutting into your next cast, and also allows you a bit of movement in between casts. As for AoE, you really just have gravity spam. You can lay down Earthly Star and that will deal a little bit of DPS, but not much in the grand scheme of things. Also, because of how the math pans out, it is actually a slight DPS increase to use gravity even on 2 targets rather than Malefic 4. It is a bit draining on your MP, but if you have the MP to spare, why the hell not, right? As you become more experienced, you'll be able to tell where your limits are and what you can and cannot get away with when it comes to postponing healing in favor of more personal DPS. There are definitely plenty of healers who adopt a far more aggressive playstyle than my own, but no matter how safe or aggressive you like to be with your personal DPS, always remember this. Your absolute #1 priority is always to make sure that everyone in your party survives. You are still a healer and that is still your role. Someone may take unexpected damage that they were not supposed to take, and it may be entirely their fault, but it still falls on you as a healer to make up for your party's mistakes and patch them up. If someone goes down, it will always result in a far larger DPS loss than if you got a few extra DPS spells in of your own. So be mindful and responsible and try to maintain a healthy balance between healing and outputting your own DPS. Alright, this is going to be another pretty quick section, but it is something we should properly discuss anyway, and that is MP management and conservation. Between all 3 healers, Astrologian kinda has it the hardest when it comes to this area in particular. But that being said, I do actually think that Shadowbringers is actually the easiest expansion so far when it comes to maintaining a healthy amount of MP. And a lot of that is due to the fact that Lucid Dreaming has had its cooldown halved to only 1 minute. This is your only way of increasing your MP as an Astrologian, as mentioned before. This will give you 3500 MP over its 21 second duration, and this is on top of the amount of MP you'd normally receive from a usual 200 MP every few seconds in battle, and also a little bit more from the amount of piety you might have. Which, since we just mentioned it, having more piety will increase the amount of MP you will receive naturally every few seconds. For every non-healer, this amount of MP is 600 outside of battle and 200 while in battle. That being said, I'd never recommend stacking piety just to increase your MP regain. We'll talk about it more in the stats section, but it just isn't worth it. And because I cannot stress enough how awesome Lightspeed is, let's not forget that any spell casted under Lightspeed will only cast half MP. This makes it a particularly great tool for reducing MP strain and healing intensive moments. And other than that, the only other advice I can really give you for conserving your MP is to just be a bit more smart with the spells you choose to cast. Nocturnal Aspected Benefic and Benefic 2 are both quite costly and should be used in moderation. Both of your Helios spells as well do cost a lot of MP. But thankfully, you have plenty of amazing abilities to lean on as an Astrologian without having to resort to spamming those spells too often. Also, we just talked about DPSing, but if there's ever a time when you are really low on MP and Lucid is still cooling down, then that is the one situation where you would be okay for not casting anything and saving some MP for healing. This probably shouldn't happen too often, unless your party is dying and you're having to cast Ascend all the time, or you just died and got revived yourself though. And if I'm being completely honest, the sheer fact that Lucid is only on a 1 minute cooldown now, as long as you're constantly cycling it throughout a fight and not having to burn a bunch of MP casting Ascend, you'll honestly probably just fine on MP throughout any encounter, honestly. And with everything else out of the way, it's finally time we take a quick look at the stats and where you should put in your focus. First things first, item level is king. A piece of gear with a higher item level will usually outclass anything with a lower item level the vast majority of the time. The difference may only be slight in some cases, but generally speaking, If given the choice, always use gear with the highest item level available to you. When it comes to the strength of your stats, weapon damage will be the absolute strongest thing when contributing to your healing and your damage dealt. After weapon damage is mind, and vitality will also increase your maximum HP, but these are all stats that will be present on just about every piece of gear and will increase with item levels, so you won't have to worry about these stats. Where you do have some choice though is your secondary stats. First off, a healer specific stat is Piety. With the change to MP in Shadowbringers, Piety no longer increases your maximum MP pool and now only increases the rate at which your MP replenishes. More specifically, you will gain more MP with the native MP regain tick that everyone has with the more Piety you have. While this can be helpful, its benefits are heavily outweighed by just about every other stat, so it's not something you really want to put your focus into ever, really. Spell speed will increase the rate at which you cast spells and will also increase the potency of your healing over time and damage over time abilities. Spell speed is by far the worst stat to have as a healer in general. Like Piety, it does have some benefits, but those benefits are heavily outweighed by every other secondary stat. It takes a massive amount of spell speed to make a noticeable decrease in the cast time of your spells, and Astrologian just so happens to have plenty of instant cast abilities and spells for when situation calls for it, not to mention swift cast and light speed to completely eliminate cast times altogether. Spell speed is definitely the lowest priority stat for just about any healer. But the next three secondary stats are the ones that have the most merit and where I'd recommend you place the most focus. First off is Determination. This will very simply increase your healing and damage dealt by a small amount. You can kinda consider Determination to be similar to mine, just less effective per point. Despite how basic and simple Determination is, it is a very consistent stat and a solid choice. Next up is Critical Hit Rate. The more crit you have stacked, the higher the frequency that you will critical heal or critically deal damage. And also the amount of extra healing or extra damage dealt that a critical hit deals will increase with the more critical hit rate you have. Critical hit rate, by all means, is a very inconsistent stat. You cannot force a crit when you may want one, at least not on Astrologian. However, critical hit rate is an exceptionally strong and effective stat for both healing and damage nonetheless. You won't ever cast a spell and hope that it crits, and sometimes you may crit a spell that ends up overhealing. But there will also be times when you have fallen behind on healing, and a crit heal can help you catch up, and that is certainly a good feeling, and no one is ever going to complain about critting a DPS spell. And the last stat worth considering for Astrologian is Direct Hit Rate. Direct Hit Rate is actually a DPS specific stat, and the only way to actually obtain any of it as a healer is for it to be melded into your gear or for you to eat food. So what does direct hit do for you? The more direct hit you have, the higher chance you have for your DPS spells to direct hit and deal more damage than a normal attack. But you cannot get a direct hit heal. Direct hit will only affect DPS spells and abilities. I am not the hugest fan of direct hit for healers, but I do understand its appeal. Direct hit is really there for healers who prefer to be more aggressive with a personal DPS. Unlike with Determination or Critical Hit Rate, Direct Hit cannot affect your heals in any way, and it's really for that reason alone that I prefer those two stats over Direct Hit. But if you want to adopt a more aggressive playstyle, then Direct Hit is one of the best choices you have available. When it comes down to it, how you choose to prioritize your stats as a healer is completely up to you. However, if you're asking how I personally prioritize my stats, then I actually go mostly for Critical Hit Rate, followed by Determination and Direct Hit Rate. I will never meld Piety or Spell Speed, but if it happens to be on my highest item level option, I won't complain about having them. And those are pretty much my thoughts on stats for healers. And with that, I do think we've gone over just about every major topic I've wanted to cover in this guide, and thank goodness too, because my voice is about to go out. Just looking at the size of this script, I can tell it's going to be another long video, but that's pretty par for the course for me. All that's really left now is just some closing thoughts. First off, like I pretty much like to say in every healer guide that I do, being a healer is kind of tough. Healers really do have the most difficult role in a lot of instances. Even something as simple as a dungeon run can be tasking for a healer, especially for anyone who is new to healing. And healing can be especially rough in the Duty Finder. You'll find plenty of tanks who will refuse to use their defensive cooldowns. You'll also run into DPS who will insist on doing their single target rotation when there are 10 enemies. Being a healer can be truly rough at times, and a lot of the time, that hard work is often taken for granted and overlooked. Healers are really underappreciated. If you're new to healing or just new to Astrologian, then know you already have my appreciation and respect for wanting to better yourself by looking up a guide and wanting to learn, and I'm very humbled that you chose my guide to peruse. And I wish you the best of luck. Healers are the heart of any party. No one can carry a party quite like a healer can. And when you are put under a situation that seems like you probably won't make it, but you persevere and you pull through with your skill and tactics, it's a feeling that you won't ever feel playing a tank or a DPS. And it's that feeling that keeps me going as a healer, and also you guys for taking the time to watch my videos. So thank you all once again for watching. Please leave a like, comment if you want to, and I'll see you guys in another video. Sayonara, bye bye.